Have you ever felt that, even trying to do everything right, something inside you remains misaligned, as if there is an invisible distance between your life and the peace you seek so much? As if your prayers echo in silence and your efforts are never enough to put everything in place? There is a type of restlessness that does not appear on the outside, but that consumes inside, a weight that cannot be explained. It is only felt, especially in the quietest moments of the day, when the mind slows down and the heart begins to reveal what has been ignored for so long. It is as if there were a constant, repetitive, almost suffocating question: why does nothing really seem complete? And the more time passes, the more this discomfort silently grows, infiltrating thoughts, robbing the lightness of small things, and creating a feeling that something essential has been lost, even without knowing exactly what it is. You try to adjust habits, improve attitudes, seek answers, but deep down there is the perception that the root of this is not in what you do, but in something deeper, something that cannot be solved with human effort alone. But what if there was a key that has always been in front of your eyes, present in the oldest and at the same time most ignored words? A principle so simple that many pass by it without realizing it, but so powerful that when applied, it begins to reorganize everything, from the inside out, bringing an order that cannot be explained, only lived. Something that Abraham understood when he left everything behind, and that Jesus revealed in a direct way, but that few actually practice. The Bible states in Proverbs 3:9-10, "Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your income, and your barns will be filled abundantly," revealing a principle that goes far beyond what it seems. And in Matthew 6:33, Jesus says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." There is an order hidden in these words, a spiritual code that, when understood, begins to align what seems confusing today. What will be revealed here is not a theory. It is not something distant or impossible, but a real, accessible and transformative path which can change the way you live even today. And as you continue, something within you will begin to perceive that which once seemed invisible. And as that truth begins to make sense within you, something even deeper opens up, because along this journey you will realize that honoring God is not about repeating words, but about living decisions that transform everything around you. From silent thoughts to choices that define entire destinies. Here, you'll discover biblical teachings that reveal how God works behind the scenes, even when everything seems confusing, bringing direction, restoring broken areas, and rekindling a peace that seemed lost. Each step will lead you to a clearer perception of God's presence in your life, as if he were speaking directly to your heart at this moment. And if this message has already started to touch you in some way, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this simple gesture can take this word to someone who desperately needs to find hope again. And this is exactly where something begins to change quietly, because many people try to honor God with outward attitudes, but ignore the basis of it all, which is true fear. Not that fear that paralyzes, but a deep reverence that repositions the heart before who God really is. This fear is not born of obligation, it is born of revelation, of a moment when the person realizes that he is facing something much greater than his own understanding. This is what happened to Isaiah when he had a vision of God's glory, and instead of asking for help, solution, or answer, he simply said, "Woe is me! I'm lost, for I am a man of unclean lips," as it is in Isaiah 6:5. This kind of reaction is not common because it reveals a heart that has finally seen God's holiness in a real way. And when this happens, something inside the person breaks, not in a negative way, but in a necessary way, because pride begins to disappear and gives way to a more sensitive, more attentive, more aligned spiritual consciousness. That is why Proverbs 1:7 declares that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, showing that it all begins here, that there is no true spiritual growth without this foundation. Without this fear, the person can even do things right, but inside, he remains disconnected, living a superficial faith that depends on moments and circumstances. True fear changes the way you think, even before you change the way you act. It creates an internal filter that prevents hasty decisions, impulsive words, and ways that seem good, but that lead away from God's will. It is as if something inside you begins to alert, to direct, to show when something is not right, even if no one around notices. And this is what differentiates those who only believe from those who truly live a life aligned with God. People who do not develop this fear tend to remember God only when they need to, but those who carry this principle live in constant spiritual attention. As someone who knows that every choice has a weight, that every attitude builds or destroys something invisible. And the most impressive thing is that this fear opens doors that no effort can open. It creates a sensitivity that allows us to perceive God's direction even in the simplest details, even in silence, where many think that God is not speaking. It is at this point that everything begins to make sense, because honoring God ceases to be something external and becomes a continuous internal posture, a way of living that transforms ordinary decisions into deep spiritual acts. And if, as you listen to this, something inside you has awakened, as if it were a silent call, don't ignore it, because this may be exactly the moment when God is trying to align your heart with Him. If this message spoke to you in a special way, write Amen in the comments, because sometimes a simple attitude can mark the beginning of a change that you didn't even imagine you needed. And when this fear begins to take hold within you, it naturally leads to another level that few can sustain: invisible obedience, the one that no one applauds, that no one recognizes, but which carries a spiritual weight capable of changing entire destinies. Because it is easy to obey when there are quick results, when there is confirmation, when other people notice, but true honor to God is revealed when you remain firm, even without signs, even without return, even when it seems that nothing is happening. It was exactly like that with Noah, who for years built an ark in a setting where there was no evidence of rain, no human logic that justified that effort, just a word received from God. And in Genesis 6:22, something simple but profoundly powerful is recorded. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, he did so. This phrase carries a level of fidelity that many ignore because it shows no emotion, shows no doubt, does not show recognition, only shows constancy, discipline, and confidence. Noah did not negotiate the instruction, did not adapt it to make it easier, did not give up in the middle of the process. And it is precisely this kind of obedience that activates something in the spiritual world, because God is not looking for perfection. He is looking for hearts that remain steadfast, even when they do not understand everything. Jesus reinforces this directly in Luke 16:10, when he says, "He who is faithful in a little is also faithful in much." And here there is a detail that many people miss because they want to live big promises, big answers, big changes, but they ignore small instructions that have already been given. Sometimes what seems small is exactly what is unlocking something big, but as it doesn't seem important, it ends up being left aside. Invisible obedience requires maturity because it confronts the human need for recognition. It is a place where you keep doing what is right simply because God has spoken, not because someone is watching, not because there will be immediate reward, but because there is an inner conviction that cannot be ignored. And it is in this silent environment that destinies begin to be altered, paths are prepared, and things that cannot yet be seen begin to take shape. There is a spiritual dimension where God begins to trust more, to direct more, to deliver more. But this only happens when he finds someone who does not negotiate principles, someone who remains faithful even in the simplest details. And perhaps what is missing for some areas of your life to align is not more effort, but more faithfulness in the little things that God has already placed before you. And if that truth is stirring something up there, like a silent reminder of something you already knew but had let go of, turn it into a practical answer now. Write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth," as a sincere prayer, a sign that you are willing to obey, even in the unseen. And leave your like on this video, because it can take that message to someone who also needs to understand the power of silent obedience. And it is at this point that many people get confused without realizing it, because they believe that honoring God is only linked to what they do on the outside, to visible attitudes, to beautiful words or religious habits, but they ignore what God is really observing all the time, which is the heart. Because it is possible to do everything right in front of people and still be misaligned inside, carrying confusing intentions, wrong motivations and thoughts that have never been dealt with. And this is exactly what the Bible confronts when it declares in 1 Samuel 16:7, "The Lord does not see as man sees. Man sees the appearance, but the Lord sees the heart." This truth is profound and uncomfortable, because it removes any possibility of hiding what is inside. Before God, there is no appearance that sustains a true spiritual life. And that is why David, even though he had known faults, was called a man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect, but because he was true. He did not hide his weaknesses. He did not pretend a spirituality that did not exist. He stood before God with sincerity, willing to be corrected, molded, and transformed. Inner alignment begins exactly in this place, when the person stops trying to appear and begins to seek to be true before God. This takes courage, because it means facing areas that have been ignored for too long, recognizing thoughts that need to be adjusted, and allowing God to enter places that no one else sees. It's not a comfortable process, but it's absolutely necessary for anyone who wants to live a truly aligned life. Jesus made this very clear when he confronted the Pharisees at Matthew 23:27, saying, "You are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly really look beautiful, but inwardly they are full of dead men's bones." This statement was not just a criticism. It was a direct warning about the danger of living a faith based only on appearance. Because when the outside does not reflect the inside, life becomes heavy, incoherent, and empty. But when the heart begins to be treated, something changes naturally. Attitudes are no longer an effort and become a consequence. Obedience flows more lightly, decisions become clearer, and peace begins to occupy a space that was previously taken by internal conflict. There is no longer that feeling of being divided, trying to sustain something on the outside, while on the inside, everything is disorganized. This is the point where honoring God ceases to be a burden and becomes a natural expression of who you really are. And perhaps as you listen to this, there is something inside of you being touched, something that needs to be aligned, adjusted, or even given more sincerely. If this made sense to you in any way, write in the comments a simple but truth-laden phrase, "Lord, transform my heart." Because sometimes a heartfelt statement is the first step to real change that starts from the inside out. And when the heart begins to be truly aligned, an inevitable consequence arises, the need to prioritize what really sustains the spiritual life. And it is here that many get lost without realizing it, because they try to advance, conquer, solve problems and reach answers, but ignore the essential, the presence of God. Moses understood this in a way that few do, and that's why he made a statement that completely changes the way we see life, when he said in Exodus 33:15, "If your presence is not with us, do not bring us up from here." He was saying clearly that there was no point in conquering the promised land. There was no point in advancing. There was no point in winning if God was not present. This is a truth that directly confronts the way many people live today, because there is a constant search for quick solutions, for immediate answers, for open doors, but little attention is paid to the relationship with God. And the reality is that without His presence, even what seems like conquest can become empty over time. Because what sustains, directs, and protects are not only results, but the constant presence of God accompanying every step. In Psalm 16:11 it is written, "In your presence there is fullness of joy." This means that what many seek in external things is actually already available in God. The peace that seems distant, the security that seems lacking, the direction that seems confused, all this finds an answer when the presence of God becomes a priority. And this presence is not just a passing feeling. It is not something that depends on emotion. It is a spiritual reality that transforms the way we think, decide, and live. When one begins to live aware of this presence, something changes in a profound way. Decisions are no longer based only on human logic and are guided by a more sensitive spiritual perception. Relationships begin to be filtered more wisely. Choices become more purposeful. And even difficult moments are faced with a different security, because there is the certainty that God is there, present, guiding every detail. This priority completely redefines what success is, because success is no longer just about achieving something and becomes living in line with God. And when this happens, even what once seemed important loses strength, because something greater begins to occupy the center of life. It is no longer a matter of running after everything, but of walking with those who already have everything under control. And perhaps, without realizing it, you have tried to move forward in some areas of your life without that foundation, without that presence being a priority. And that is why everything feels heavy, confusing, or incomplete. Because when God is not at the center, everything around loses its balance. If you've come this far, it's not by chance. There is something being adjusted within you, something being repositioned in a quiet but real way. And at the end of this journey, there will be a special moment of prayer, a moment where you can connect with God in a deeper way and deliver what needs to be aligned. So stay until the end, because that may be the moment that will mark a new beginning in your spiritual life. And when the presence of God begins to occupy the central place, something inevitable appears in the path of those who decide to truly honor Him: renunciation. And this is perhaps one of the most difficult parts to accept, because it directly confronts the deepest desires, personal desires, and even plans that seemed right. Many want to live the promises, they want to feel peace, they want to see everything aligning, but they are not willing to give up what is misaligned. And that's exactly why Jesus was so direct when He said in Luke 9:23, "If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." There is no room for comfortable interpretation in this statement, because it reveals that following God requires daily decision, requires choice, requires surrender. To renounce is not just to leave things visible, it is often to give up thoughts, internal attitudes, behaviors that have already become part of the routine, but that no longer match the path that God is showing. And this generates an internal conflict, because the human heart tends to cling to what is known, to what brings immediate comfort, even if it does not bring true peace. But honoring God requires going beyond that comfort. It requires trusting that what He asks to leave is not to generate loss, but to make room for something greater. The story of Abraham reveals this in an intense way, because when God asked for Isaac, He was not just asking for a son, He was touching what was most precious. And when Abraham was willing to obey, God declared in Genesis 22:12, "Now I know that you fear God." This statement shows that renunciation reveals what really occupies the center of the heart. These are not words, they are not intentions, they are decisions that demonstrate who comes first. There is something profound in this, because often what prevents an aligned life are not big mistakes, but small attachments that are protected, justified, and maintained. And while this happens, the flow of what God wants to do is blocked. Renunciation then becomes a key not of loss, but of repositioning. It is as if, when you give up something, you are saying with your attitudes that you trust God more than yourself. And this trust begins to transform everything, because faith is no longer just an idea and becomes a daily practice. Dependence on God becomes real, not just in words, but in concrete choices. And it is in this place that something changes from the inside out, because life begins to align not by effort, but by surrender. Maybe there's something God has already shown you, something that needs to be let go, adjusted or repositioned, and deep down you know it, but there's still resistance. But each step of renunciation brings you closer to a lighter, clearer, and more connected life with what really matters. And if that message is touching exactly that spot inside you, turn that into a response now. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings," as an act of sincere surrender, and leave your like on this video because it can help other people find that same path of transformation that starts with a decision. And after understanding the value of renunciation, an even deeper need arises to learn to discern, because not everything that seems right really comes from God, and this is exactly where many people get lost, not for lack of faith, but for lack of discernment. We live in a world full of voices, opinions, pressures, and paths that seem good at first glance, but that carry invisible consequences. And when there is no such spiritual filter, the person ends up being guided by momentary emotions, impulses, or even external influences that gradually distance him from the will of God. Solomon understood this at the very beginning of his journey, when he had the opportunity to ask for anything. He did not ask for riches, nor power, nor victory over enemies. He asked for something much deeper. In 1 Kings 3:9 he says, "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people." He knew that without discernment, any decision could put everything at risk. And this is a powerful lesson, because it shows that it is not enough to want to get it right. It is necessary to know how to identify what really comes from God. Spiritual discernment works as a silent protection. It prevents you from going down wrong paths, even when those paths seem attractive. It helps you notice hidden intentions, avoid hasty decisions, and recognize when something isn't aligned, even if everything around you says otherwise. And most importantly, it is not born automatically. It is developed with time, with practice, with search, and with sensitivity to the Word of God. Hebrews 5:14 clearly reveals this when it says, "Solid food belongs to adults, who by practice have their powers trained to discern both good and bad." This means that discernment grows as you take a stand, as you choose to seek understanding, as you decide not to accept everything passively. There is a spiritual maturation that only happens when you begin to filter what you hear, what you feel, and what you decide, always in the light of God's truth. Honoring God is also this: not letting yourself be carried away in any direction, but stopping, reflecting, and seeking confirmation before acting. It is choosing not to follow the majority when the heart realizes that something is not right. It is having the courage to say no to what seems good, but is not from God. And this requires sensitivity, it requires attention, it requires a living relationship with God. In a time where everything is fast, where decisions are made without reflection, and where confusion seems to increase every day, those who develop discernment remain firm. Not because he never faces doubts, but because he has learned not to depend only on what he sees or feels, but on what God reveals. And if as you listen to this, you realize that you need to strengthen this discernment, this is already a sign that something within you is being awakened. And if this message is speaking to you in a real way, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because then this word can reach other people who also need to learn to recognize God's direction in the midst of so many voices. And when discernment begins to develop, it needs to be supported by something even stronger, because there will be times when even what you understand will not be enough. And that is exactly where faith comes in. Not a superficial faith based only on favorable feelings or circumstances, but an unshakable faith which stands firm even when everything around seems otherwise. Because the truth is that honoring God at all times requires believing even when there are no signs, even when the answers don't arrive in the expected time, even when logic tells you to give up. Hebrews 11:6 states something that leaves no room for doubt. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. This means that no matter how hard someone tries to do right, if there is no faith, the foundation is incomplete. And that faith is not just believing that God exists, it is trusting that He is at work, even when it is not possible to see. It is to keep walking when the scenario does not change. It is to maintain hope when everything seems to be at a standstill. The story of the woman with the blood flow shows this in a profound way, because she had no visible reason to believe that anything would change at that moment. On the contrary, everything around pointed to the opposite. Years of suffering, rejection, limitations, and frustrated attempts. But still, she decided to act based on something that could not be proven, only believed. She broke social barriers, faced stares, overcame fear, and advanced through the crowd with a single thought: if I just touch, everything can change. And when she touched Jesus, something happened immediately, not only in body, but in spirit. And the answer she heard was deeper than the physical miracle. In Mark 5:34, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole." He didn't highlight the touch, he didn't highlight the effort, he highlighted the faith. Because it was faith that sustained every step up to that moment. And this reveals something essential. Faith is what sustains honor, because it's faith that keeps you going when obeying doesn't make sense, when forsaking seems hard, when waiting becomes tiring. It's faith that keeps you from backtracking when everything seems uncertain. And it is precisely this posture that opens paths where there are no human possibilities, that transforms unlikely scenarios into living testimonies. Maybe you are in a moment where you see no way out, where everything seems stuck or without direction. But faith does not depend on what you see now, it rests on who God is. And when this faith begins to grow, something inside you changes. The way you react, think, and decide begins to align with a trust that cannot be explained. And if that message has reached you today, maybe it's not just from you. Maybe there's someone in your heart who also needs that touch, that intervention, that faith being strengthened. Therefore, write in the comments the name of someone who needs prayer at this time. By doing so, you connect to a chain of faith where each name presented here will be brought before God. And together, we will see something begin to move in a way that you may not have even imagined. And when faith begins to sustain each step, something inevitable happens. Life ceases to be just a personal experience and becomes a visible message to everyone around. Because honoring God was never something destined to remain hidden, limited to the interior, but something that reveals itself naturally in attitudes, choices, and the way of living. It's not about appearance, it's about essence that overflows. And that is why Jesus declared in Matthew 5:16, "Let your light so shine before men," showing that there is a light that cannot be contained when one truly lives in line with God. This light does not come from human effort. It is not built with beautiful words or attempts to impress people. It is born from a life that has been transformed from the inside out. And when that transformation happens, it starts to show up in the details, in the way you react, in the way you treat others, in the decisions you make when no one is looking. It is something silent, but extremely powerful. Daniel is a clear example of this because he lived in an environment totally contrary to his principles, surrounded by pressures, threats, and influences that could easily lead him astray. But even so, he remained steadfast, did not negotiate his faith, did not adapt his values to fit. And the result of this is recorded in Daniel 6:3. Daniel excelled because in him was a fine spirit. It wasn't the environment that defined Daniel, it was God's presence in him that made him different. And this reveals something very important. Honoring God does not depend on the circumstances around you. It depends on the decision you make within yourself. It is possible to live in the midst of chaos and still carry peace. It is possible to be surrounded by negative influences and still remain steadfast. Because when God is at the center, everything around you loses the power to lead you astray. This type of life does not seek recognition, does not live to be seen, but inevitably becomes a reference. People begin to perceive something different. They begin to feel a peace that they cannot explain. They begin to notice a firmness that is not common. And without realizing it, you become an instrument, a channel through which God begins to touch other lives. And perhaps this is one of the greatest secrets of honoring God, understanding that it is not just about what you receive, but what you transmit. Because when your life becomes aligned, it doesn't just get organized. It begins to influence, inspire, and open paths for others to find that same direction as well. And as you continue on this journey, something even deeper is being prepared, because there are spiritual dimensions that go beyond what you have realized so far. None of this is by chance. This message may be coming to you as a response, as a direction, as a turning point. So stay until the end, because there is something special in store, something that can mark a new level in your life with God. And after all this, there comes a point in the journey when faith is truly tested, not when everything is clear, but just when nothing seems to make sense, when paths close, when answers don't come, and when the future seems uncertain. It is in this scenario that honoring God requires a deeper level of trust, a surrender that does not depend on assurances, but on the assurance that God remains in control, even when you can't see the next step. Abraham lived just that, and his story reveals one of the purest expressions of trust in God. In Hebrews 11:8, it is written, "By faith Abraham, being called, obeyed, going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going." There is something very strong in this decision, because he did not have a map, he did not have detailed explanations, he did not have human security. He had only one word, and that was enough to get him moving. And that's exactly where many get stuck, because they want to understand everything before acting. They want to have control before trusting. They want guarantees before obeying. But God's direction rarely works that way. It does not reveal itself whole at once. It manifests itself step by step, as there is a willingness to trust. And that requires a kind of faith that doesn't rest on what's visible, but on the character of God. Proverbs 16:9 clearly reveals this dynamic when it says, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." This does not mean that planning is wrong, but it shows that there is a higher authority driving the final result. And to honor God in this context is to recognize that as much as you have plans, they must be subject to His will. Often, God's direction does not come as clearly and audibly as people expect. It appears in details, in a peace that confirms a decision, in a restlessness that prevents a path, in doors that open effortlessly or close, even with insistence. These are subtle but extremely accurate signs for those who are spiritually attentive. And when you start noticing that, something changes inside you. The anxiety for control decreases. The need to understand everything loses strength, and confidence begins to occupy this space. You start to walk more safely, not because you know exactly where you are going, but because you know who is guiding you. This kind of life brings a different stability, because it does not depend on external circumstances. Even in the midst of uncertainty, there is a peace that sustains, a trust that remains, a quiet certainty that no step is being taken alone. And it is at this level that honoring God ceases to be just a choice and becomes a lifestyle, where every decision is guided by something greater than human logic itself. And in the middle of this path, where you learn to trust God's direction, there is an area that is often ignored, but that influences everything: the soul. Because there is no point in moving forward externally if inside there are still open wounds, unresolved pains and memories that continue to affect thoughts, decisions, and even the way you relate to God and people. And many try to hide it, trying to look strong, trying to follow normally, but carrying a silent weight that only grows over time. Honoring God also goes through this deeper place, where you stop hiding what you feel and begin to present it before Him with sincerity. Because God doesn't just approach strength, He also moves in weakness when it's delivered in a true way. Anna's story shows exactly that. A woman who carried such intense pain that it could no longer be ignored. And instead of pretending that everything was fine, she did something that completely changed her story. In 1 Samuel 1:10 it is written, "She prayed to the Lord with bitterness of soul and wept abundantly." This moment was not just an outburst, it was a complete delivery, without filters, without reservations, without appearance. And that's exactly what is often lacking: the courage to be true before God, because there is a tendency to want to show only the strong side, only the side that seems right. But God already knows everything that is hidden. And when you decide to open that up before Him, something starts happening in a profound way. Psalm 147:3 states, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." This is not just a distant promise, it is a reality for those who allow themselves to be treated. God does not ignore pain. He enters into it. He touches where no one else can touch. He restores what seemed lost. But it requires surrender, it requires trust, it requires allowing Him to access areas that have been closed for too long. And when that healing begins, life changes from the inside out. Thoughts that were previously limited begin to be renewed. Feelings that weighed on them begin to be relieved. Decisions are made more clearly. The soul stops carrying that constant weight and begins to experience a lightness that does not depend on the circumstances. It's as if something that held you to the past finally loses its strength. This process does not happen instantaneously. It is built gradually, in each moment of surrender, in each sincere prayer, in each decision to trust God more than in one's own pain. And the more you allow God to work within you, the freer you become to live out what He has prepared. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is something inside of you that needs to be healed, something that has been guarded for a long time, but that God is bringing to the surface now. Don't ignore this, because it could be just the beginning of a deep restoration. If this word has touched your soul in any way, write in the comments, "I trust in God," as a simple but meaningful act, a sign that you are willing to allow Him to begin this work within you. And after experiencing this process of inner healing, something begins to become evident in an almost inevitable way: the need to return closer to God, because often pain, distractions, and even routine end up creating a silent, almost imperceptible distance. It is not something that happens all at once, but little by little, in small choices, in moments when the presence of God ceases to be a priority and is replaced by other things. When the person realizes he no longer feels the same sensitivity, he no longer has the same clarity, and something inside him knows that he needs to come back, but he does not know where to start. It is exactly at this point that spiritual reconnection becomes essential, not as a passing feeling, but as an intentional decision. The parable of the prodigal son shows this in a profound way, because that son not only physically moved away, he disconnected from everything that represented the relationship with his father. But there was a moment when he realized his condition and decided to return. And in Luke 15:20 it is written, "And he arose and went to his father, and while he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion." This scene reveals something powerful. The father did not wait for his son to arrive completely. He saw him from afar, ran towards him and received him with love. This shows that God is not far away, waiting for perfection. He is ready to restore the moment there is a sincere movement of return. No matter how far one has drifted away, no matter how much time has passed, there is always a way back. But this reconnection requires something that many avoid: decision. It is not enough to feel like it. It is necessary to act. James 4:8 states, "Draw close to God, and he will draw near to you." There is a divine response when there is a human step. And this step may seem simple, but it carries enormous spiritual weight because it involves repentance, a change of direction, and a willingness to let go of what created that distance. To honor God on this level is to recognize that nothing replaces intimacy with Him. It is to understand that there is no lasting peace apart from His presence. And when this reconnection happens, something begins to be restored immediately. Peace returns, clarity returns, purpose begins to make sense again. That feeling of emptiness begins to disappear, because the place that was disconnected is now being filled again. And maybe, without realizing it, you have moved away a little, not intentionally, but because of circumstances, distractions, day-to-day worries. But the most important thing is not how far you have strayed. It is the fact that there is still an open way to return, and God continues to look in your direction, ready to restore what seemed lost. If you're here right now, there's a reason. God allowed this message to reach you because He wants to bring you back to this place of intimacy, peace, and direction. Do not leave this video before you receive all that is yet to be revealed, because something deeper is being prepared to transform the way you live and connect with God. And when this reconnection happens, something arises that many ignore, but which completely defines the course of spiritual life, the understanding of time. Because it is not enough just to return to God, it is necessary to respond at the right time. It is necessary to act when He calls, because there are opportunities that do not remain open forever. And this is a delicate point because many people feel God's touch, realize that they need to change something, adjust paths, make decisions, but end up postponing it, leaving it for later, as if there was always a new chance guaranteed. The story of Jonah and the city of Nineveh reveals just that: a specific moment, a determined time, an opportunity that could not be ignored. In Jonah 3:4 it is written, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." It was not a symbolic message, it was a direct warning, of course, with a defined deadline. And what changed the fate of that city was not just the message, it was the immediate response. They didn't wait, they didn't question, they didn't postpone, they acted. And that decision completely changed what seemed already determined. This shows that there are times when God speaks more intensely, times when something inside you is awakened differently, as if it were an urgent call, a need for change that can no longer be ignored. And in these moments, the response needs to be quick, because the delay can be spiritually costly. Not because God stops loving, but because the opportunity for transformation can be lost. In 2 Corinthians 6:2 it is written, "Behold, now is the acceptable time, and behold, now is the day of salvation." This word does not point to tomorrow, it points to now. And this directly confronts the human tendency to postpone important decisions, to wait for the perfect moment, to try to organize everything before taking a step. But in the spiritual life, the right time is not when everything is perfect, it is when God speaks. Spiritual procrastination is silent, but extremely dangerous. It makes the person recognize what needs to be done, but never execute it. It creates a false sense of control, as if there is still time, as if nothing will change. But in the meantime, opportunities are lost, cycles keep repeating themselves, and what could be transformed remains the same. Honoring God is also recognizing this time. It is understanding that when He calls, there is a purpose at that moment. There is something being aligned, something being released, something being prepared. And responding to that call at the right time opens doors that may not open again in the same way. Perhaps, as you listen to this, there is something you already know you need to do, a decision that has been postponed, a change that has already been shown but has not yet been put into practice. And that moment now may be exactly the right time you've been waiting for, not because everything is perfect, but because God is speaking. And if you feel that God has been good to you, even in the midst of failures, even in the midst of delays, acknowledge it simply but sincerely. Write in the comments, Amen, as a declaration of faith and gratitude, not only for what has already happened, but for what begins to be aligned from now on. And when someone decides to respond at the right time, something begins to happen that goes far beyond life itself, because honoring God is no longer just a personal experience and becomes a living testimony, something that influences, reaches, and transforms other people in a real way. And this does not only happen in moments of victory, but especially in difficult phases, when fidelity is put to the test, and even so, the person chooses to remain firm. Joseph's story reveals this in a profound way because he faced rejection, betrayal, injustice, and times when all seemed lost. He was sold by his own brothers. He was unjustly imprisoned, forgotten by those who promised to help him. And yet, at no time did he abandon his faith or allow pain to define who he was. And when at last all came together, he declared something that reveals a rare spiritual maturity. As it is written in Genesis 50:20, "You have meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This view changes everything, because it shows that even what seemed negative was part of a larger plan. And that's exactly what turns an ordinary story into a powerful testimony. It is not the absence of problems that marks a life, but the way she goes through these moments trusting in God. And when someone lives like this, their life begins to speak for itself. Revelation 12:11 states, "They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of his testimony." This reveals that testimony has power, not just as a story told, but as living proof that God is still at work. Each experience, each overcoming, each moment of faith becomes a message that can reach someone who is going through something similar. Honoring God is also allowing your life to be used in this way, without hiding the process, without trying to erase the marks, but understanding that even scars can carry meaning, because often what you've overcome can be exactly what someone needs to hear in order not to give up. And when you understand this, your way of living changes, because you realize that it's not just about you, but about the impact that your life can generate. This type of testimony crosses generations, because it is not limited to the present. It influences children, family members, close people, and even strangers. It creates a chain of transformation that continues even when you're not seeing it. And it all starts with a simple decision to continue honoring God in any situation. Maybe you don't realize it yet, but your story is already being built as a testimony. Each choice, each attitude, each moment of faith is forming something that can impact other lives in a profound way. And as you continue on this path, something even stronger is being prepared. This word is not for any time. It carries a specific purpose. If you are here now, there is something that God wants to show you, something that can transform not only your life, but everything around you. Stick around until the end, because what's yet to come can open your eyes in a way you never imagined. And as this journey progresses, something becomes increasingly clear. Honoring God does not happen in a single moment. It is not an isolated decision that solves everything at once, but a continuous, daily, silent process that shapes who you are inside. Many people start with intensity, feel something strong, make important decisions, but over time they end up returning to the same patterns, the same thoughts, the same behaviors. And this happens because they have not yet understood that true transformation is not an event, it is a path. Paul reveals this very directly in Romans 12:2 when he says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." He's not talking about something superficial. He is talking about a profound change which begins in the way of thinking and, from there, begins to reflect in all areas of life. Because before changing attitudes, God works on the mind, adjusts perceptions, corrects beliefs, repositions values. And this process is not always quick or easy, because it involves deconstructing things that have been built over the years. It involves abandoning old ways of reacting, of seeing situations, of dealing with people. And often, the biggest challenge is not outside, but inside, in what needs to be constantly renewed. Peter's story shows this very clearly. He started out being impulsive, emotional, often spoke without thinking, acted without measuring consequences. At one point, he declared total allegiance to Jesus, and a short time later, he denied him 3 times. This shows that he was still in process. But the most important thing wasn't how it started, it was how it allowed itself to be transformed over time. After living deep experiences with Jesus, after being confronted, corrected, and restored, Peter became someone firm, stable, a spiritual reference. He was not born ready, he was molded. And this is exactly what happens to those who decide to truly honor God, go through a continuous process of transformation. In 2 Corinthians 3:18 it is written, "We are changed from glory to glory." This means that this change happens in levels, in stages, progressively. It's not about immediate perfection, it's about constant growth. It's about looking back and realizing that you're no longer the same person, that something has changed, that something has been adjusted. And this process requires some things that cannot be ignored: humility to recognize that there is still room for change, discipline to continue even when there is no emotion, and willingness to grow, even when it requires getting out of the comfort zone. Because God does not force this transformation, He does. But the decision to continue is yours, and the more you allow God to work in you, the lighter life becomes, the clearer the direction becomes, the firmer your walk becomes. Because inner transformation is the most evident proof that God is not only present, He is acting, molding, and preparing you for something greater that is yet to come. And as this inner transformation takes place, a need arises that cannot be ignored: the connection with other people who are living the same journey. Because no matter how strong someone is, the spiritual journey was never intended to be lived alone. There is a silent risk in isolation, because when one moves away from faith-strengthening connections, they also gradually begin to lose sensitivity, direction, and even motivation. The early church understood this very clearly, and so it lived in unity, sharing not only moments of faith, but life itself. In Acts 2:42 it is written, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayers." This was not just a religious practice, it was a lifestyle. They walk together, learn together, face challenges together. And this union generated something powerful, collective spiritual force. Because there are times when individual faith weakens, days when the mind gets confused, situations when the will to give up appears silently. And it is exactly in these moments that the presence of other people who share the same faith makes all the difference. A word, a piece of advice, a prayer, all of this can reposition someone who is about to get lost on the way. Hebrews 10:25 reinforces this when it says, "Do not leave our congregation." This is not just a recommendation, it is a protection. Because fellowship creates an environment where there is encouragement, where there is correction when needed, where there is constant growth. And honoring God also involves valuing these relationships, understanding that God uses people to strengthen people. Healthy relationships within faith are not just about being together, but about growing together. It's having someone who reminds you of purpose when you forget, who confronts you with love when you stray, who walks by your side even when things aren't easy. This creates a solid foundation, a structure that sustains the spiritual walk over time. Isolation, on the other hand, weakens. It creates space for doubts to grow without being confronted, for negative thoughts to gain strength, for wrong decisions to feel right. And many times, without realizing it, the person moves away, not only from people, but also from God. But when there is communion, something different happens. Faith is strengthened, hope is renewed, and the journey becomes lighter because it is no longer lonely. There is support, there is exchange, there is continuous growth. And maybe you've come this far because of a message, but there are many other people who also need to hear something like this today. Have you ever thought about it? By interacting with this video, you can become an instrument to reach someone who is in need of direction, consolation, or a word of hope. So, if you want to be part of it, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because together we can take this message even further. And when the journey stops being solitary and starts to be strengthened by true connections, something even deeper begins to reveal itself. The understanding that your life is not random, it is not a set of meaningless events, but carries a specific calling, a purpose that was defined by God even before you existed. And this perception changes everything because it takes life out of the automatic and puts every detail into a bigger plan. Many people live for years without realizing it, just following routines, making decisions without clear direction, feeling an emptiness that is difficult to explain, as if something is missing. And in fact, what is often missing is not more effort, nor more achievements, but connection with the purpose for which they were created. Because when someone ignores this call, they may even advance in some areas, but inside, they continue to feel that something is not complete. Jeremiah experienced this awakening very strongly, when God declared in Jeremiah 1:5, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." This statement reveals something profound. Purpose doesn't start when you find out, it existed before. This means that your life is not a coincidence. It is not just the result of circumstances, but it is part of something that was thought, planned, and established by God. And when you begin to understand this, each choice takes on new weight. Decisions are no longer just personal and start to carry a spiritual meaning. Honoring God, then, becomes living with intention, with the awareness that even the details can be part of this greater purpose. It's not just about big actions, but about the way you live your day to day, how you treat people, how you respond to challenges. Ephesians 2:10 reinforces this when it says, "We are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." This shows that there is a prepared path, a direction that can be followed, a life that can be lived with meaning. But this path is not imposed. It needs to be recognized and chosen. And here there is an important point. Many people associate purpose with something grandiose, visible, recognized by all. But this is not always the case. Purpose often reveals itself in simple things, in daily attitudes, in decisions that seem small, but that have a real impact. It is living in line with God in every area, not just at specific times. When someone responds to that call, something changes profoundly. Life gains direction. Choices make more sense, and even challenges are seen in a different way, not as purposeless obstacles, but as part of a process of growth and preparation. And little by little, that emptiness begins to disappear, because now there is clarity, there is alignment, there is the certainty that you are not only existing, but living something that was planned by God. And when this purpose begins to make sense, an even more refined need arises, to learn to listen to the voice of God, because it is not enough to know that there is a path, it is necessary to recognize the direction while walking. And this is one of the most delicate points of the spiritual life, because many people expect God to speak in an evident, strong, unquestionable way, but this is not always the case. Most of the time, God's voice doesn't come in noise, it comes in silence. Elias lived exactly this experience at a time of extreme fragility. He had already seen miracles, he had already witnessed powerful manifestations, so his expectation was to meet God in the same way, in something grandiose, impactful. But what happened was completely different. In 1 Kings 19:12, it is written, "And after the fire, a still, small voice." God was not in the strong wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in an almost imperceptible whisper. This reveals something profound. God does not need a spectacle to speak. He often chooses silence to communicate, because it is in silence that the heart slows down, that the mind is organized, and that spiritual sensitivity becomes sharper. The problem is that the world around us is increasingly noisy, full of distractions, opinions, information, and pressures that constantly compete for attention. And when there is a lot of external noise, God's internal voice begins to be drowned. Not because he stopped speaking, but because there is no space to listen. Honoring God is also learning to create this space. It is developing an inner silence, even in the midst of routine, even in the midst of responsibilities. It's stopping, reflecting, seeking, paying attention. Jesus made this clear at John 10:27 when he said, "My sheep hear my voice." This means that listening to God is not something impossible or reserved for a few, but it requires relationship, it requires closeness, it requires practice. The closer you get, the easier it becomes to recognize that voice. And it doesn't always come with audible words, it often comes as a conviction, a clear direction, a peace that confirms, or a restlessness that alerts. And when you start developing that sensitivity, something changes completely. You stop being guided only by external opinions or passing emotions and start to live with a different security, a trust that is born from within, not from what others say, but from what God confirms in your heart. Maybe you felt that at some point, that feeling that you should do something or avoid something, even without logical explanation. This is often God trying to direct. But if there is no attention, that voice can be ignored. And if while you hear this, something inside you is being awakened, such as a desire to get closer, to hear more clearly, don't let it go. Write in the comments, "God cares for me," as a simple way to declare that you trust that direction, even when it comes in silence. And when you learn to recognize God's voice, something even deeper begins to sustain your walk. The promises he has released about your life, because listening to direction is essential, but standing firm when everything seems contrary is what really reveals an aligned heart. And it is exactly here that many are weakened, because they receive a word, they feel a confirmation, But when time passes and nothing changes, they begin to doubt, they begin to question, they begin to think that perhaps it was not quite like that. But honoring God is also staying when there are no signs. It is continuing to trust even when reality seems to contradict what has been promised. Sarah's story reveals this in a striking way, because humanly speaking, there was no longer any possibility. Time had passed, the limitations were evident, and everything pointed to the impossible. Still, the promise did not fail. Not because circumstances changed first, but because God never fails to fulfill what he declares. Hebrews 10:23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful." This shows that the responsibility is not in understanding how it will happen, but in remaining firm while it does not happen. And this requires a mature faith, a trust that is not shaken by time or circumstances. In Numbers 23:19 it is written, "God is not a man that he should lie." This statement is an unshakable foundation because it reveals that God's faithfulness does not depend on external factors. He doesn't change, he doesn't go back, he doesn't forget. What he says, he fulfills. What he promises, he does, at the right time, in the right way. And that's exactly why promises work as an anchor. Because while everything around you can fluctuate, while feelings can vary, while situations can change, the promise stands firm, sustaining, holding, preventing you from being carried away by doubt or fear. She keeps her soul stable, even when the scenario is unstable. Those who learn to live sustained by these promises develop a different strength. It is not the absence of difficulty, but it is firmness in the midst of it. It's not a lack of challenges, but it's security in spite of them. Because trust is not in what is seen, but in what has been said by God. Maybe you're in a moment where it seems like nothing is moving forward, where what you hoped for hasn't happened yet. But that doesn't mean that God has forgotten. It doesn't mean that the promise has lost its validity. Often, silence is part of the process. Time is part of preparation. And what seems to take time is actually being aligned perfectly. And as you continue here, something even deeper is being built within you, a foundation that will not be shaken easily. What you will hear in the next few moments may be exactly the answer you needed, something that many do not realize in time. So stay until the end, because there is something being revealed that can completely transform the way you see everything around you. And when this trust in promises begins to take hold, it is taken to an even deeper level when life goes through losses. Moments when something precious is taken away, when what seemed safe ceases to exist, and the heart is confronted with a pain that cannot be ignored. It is in this scenario that honoring God becomes one of the purest expressions of faith, because continuing to trust when all is well is one thing, but standing firm when something is lost requires a much deeper kind of relationship. Job lived just that, and his story is not just about suffering, but about an honor that surpasses any circumstance. He lost possessions, he lost his family, he lost his stability, and yet his reaction was not one of revolt against God, but of reverence. In Job 1:21 he declared, "The Lord gave him, the Lord took him, blessed be the name of the Lord." This posture reveals a heart that was not only attached to blessings, but to God himself. And this completely changes the way of dealing with losses, because when faith is based only on what you receive, any loss can shake everything. But when faith is grounded in who God is, there is a strength that sustains even in the most difficult moments. This does not mean the absence of pain. It does not mean that there is no sadness, but it does mean that even though we feel all this, confidence remains. Lamentations 3:22-23 reveals something essential for these moments. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of not being consumed. They are renewed every morning. This shows that hope is not tied to what has been lost, but to what continues to be renewed by God every day. There is something that remains, something that cannot be taken away, something that sustains even when everything around seems to fall apart. To honor God at this level is to go through pain without losing faith. It is to walk even with a heavy heart. It is to trust even when there are no explanations. And it is precisely this process that generates a deep spiritual maturity, an inner strength that does not depend on favorable circumstances to exist, because little by little, something begins to change inside you. Pain is no longer just a burden and becomes a place of transformation. Loss is no longer just an end and begins to reveal new paths that were not visible before. And faith, which once depended on results, is now sustained by a more solid, more mature, truer trust. And even though everything seems uncertain, there is one certainty that remains. God remains in control. He is still present. He continues to see. He continues to act, even when it is not possible to perceive it. And this renewed hope does not ignore what has been lost, but allows us to move forward with the conviction that what will still be built by God can be greater than all that is left behind. And it is precisely at this point, when the pain has already been faced and hope begins to be rebuilt, that something even deeper is revealed, the ability to find consolation not in quick answers, but in the very presence of God. Because often what is most desired in difficult times is an immediate solution, a visible change, a clear answer. But God doesn't always act that way. In many moments, He chooses not to remove the valley, but to walk together within it. David expresses this powerfully in Psalm 23:4 when he says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Notice that he does not say that he would not pass through the valley, but that even if he did, he would not be afraid. And the reason was not the absence of the problem, but the presence of God. This completely changes the way we face any situation, because security is no longer in the circumstances and becomes in the company of God. There is a profound difference between being delivered from something and being sustained within something. And often, what transforms the soul is not immediate deliverance, but the experience of realizing that God has not stepped away, that He is still present, that He is sustaining every step, even when everything seems difficult. This presence brings a kind of peace that cannot be explained, only felt. In 2 Corinthians 1:3-4, it is written, "God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction." This reveals that God does not only see suffering, He enters into it, He draws near, He comforts in a real way. And this consolation is not superficial, it is not something momentary, it is something that reaches the deepest parts of the soul, bringing rest where there was restlessness before. Honoring God is also allowing Him to occupy that place, the place of emotional refuge. It is to stop looking in people, situations, or quick solutions for what only the presence of God can offer. It is trusting that even without understanding everything, there is a care being released, a peace being built, a strength being renewed. And when someone learns to live like this, something changes definitively. Anxiety begins to lose space, despair no longer dominates as it used to, and stability begins to form inside. Not because everything is perfect, but because there is a certainty. God is present. And this certainty sustains, strengthens, and brings balance even on the most difficult days. And the most impressive thing is that this consolation does not stop with you. When you experience this care from God, you become able to pass it on to others. Your life becomes a channel of consolation, a reference of faith, a proof that it is possible to go through difficult times without losing peace. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is something inside of you that needs that solace right now, something that is still heavy, something that has not yet been completely delivered. Don't keep it to yourself. Before we move on, write in the comments what is in your heart, a prayer request, something you want to put before God. Because when there is unity in faith, something powerful begins to happen, and that can be the opportunity to see real change begin. And after experiencing this deep solace that comes from God's presence, something begins to awaken in a more sensitive way within you. The ability to realize that God has never stopped speaking, has never stopped communicating, but it has often been distraction that has prevented this perception. Because God is not limited to obvious or extraordinary ways to reveal himself, he also manifests himself in the details, in the circumstances, in small signs that go unnoticed by those who are spiritually distant or distracted. Gideon lived a moment like this, full of doubts, insecurities, and questions, not knowing exactly if what was happening was really God speaking to him. And instead of ignoring this, he did something that many have difficulty doing. He asked for confirmation. In Judges 6:17 it is written, "If I have now found favor in your sight, give me a sign." And God answered. This shows that God understands human limitations. He knows our insecurities and, in many moments, allows confirmations to strengthen the journey. But there is an important point here. These signs are not substitutes for faith. They do not come to eliminate the need to trust, but to confirm directions, to align decisions, and to strengthen the heart at specific times. The problem is that many people expect big, visible, unquestionable signs and end up ignoring what God is already showing in a more subtle way. Jesus called attention to just that in Matthew 16:3 when he said, "Do you know how to discern the face of heaven? And do you not know the signs of the times?" He was showing that people could interpret natural things, but they couldn't perceive what God was doing spiritually. And this continues to happen because excessive distraction prevents sensitivity. Honoring God also involves developing that spiritual attention, that ability to notice when something is not just a coincidence, when a door that closes can be direction, when an unexpected peace can be confirmation, when a restlessness can be a warning. These are signs that, when observed sensitively, begin to form a clear path. And the more you develop this, the clearer the perception of God's action in your life becomes. You begin to understand that He is present in details that previously went unnoticed. Little things begin to make sense, connections begin to emerge, directions begin to align in ways that cannot be explained by logic alone. This spiritual awareness completely changes the way you live, because you stop walking on automatic and start living attentive, sensitive, connected. And that ongoing connection keeps you aligned with God's will, even in the midst of simple day-to-day decisions. And little by little, what once seemed like silence begins to reveal signs. What seemed like confusion begins to gain direction. And what seemed like a coincidence begins to show that there is a hand guiding every detail, leading you precisely to what has been prepared. And as this spiritual sensitivity is awakened, you begin to notice something that previously went completely unnoticed. Many of the most intense battles you face are not visible. They are not only in the external circumstances, in the people, or in the situations, but in a spiritual dimension that requires another type of posture, another type of understanding. Because fighting only with human strength against spiritual problems is like trying to solve something profound with superficial tools. The Bible reveals this directly at Ephesians 6:12 when it says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood." This completely changes the way we see life's conflicts. Often the weariness, the confusion, the emotional weight, the doors that close, all of this has roots that go beyond what the eye can see. And when there is no such understanding, the person fights in the wrong way, gets more tired, gets more frustrated, and does not understand why nothing changes. Jehoshaphat faced such a situation when a great army rose up against him. Humanly speaking, there was no chance of victory, but instead of reacting with desperation or ordinary strategies, he sought God. And the answer he received was something that defies any human logic. In 2 Chronicles 20:15 it is written, "In this battle ye shall not have to fight, the Lord is with you." That doesn't mean he didn't do anything, but it does mean that he understood who was really in control of the battle. And this reveals a powerful principle. There are times when the greatest strategy is not to act forcefully, but to position oneself spiritually. It is praying when everything calls for despair. It is trusting when all seems lost. It is standing firm when the scenario tells you to back down. Because spiritual victory is not born of human ability, but of alignment with God. Honoring God also involves this awareness, understanding that not everything is solved with effort, that not every battle is won with direct confrontation. Some are overcome in the silence of prayer, in the steadfastness of faith, in the confidence that God is fighting for you, even when you don't see it. And when you start living like that, something changes profoundly. Fear loses strength, anxiety decreases, and security begins to grow inside, not because the problems have disappeared, but because you know you're not fighting alone. There is a greater force at work. There is an invisible protection. There is a direction being established. This does not mean passivity, but it means acting with discernment, knowing when to move forward, when to wait, when to pray more, when to talk less. It is a life guided not only by what one sees, but by what one discerns spiritually. And maybe some battles that you have faced are not only natural. Maybe there is something deeper happening, something that requires this change of posture, this more intense search, this firmer trust. And when you realize this, you stop reacting in the same way and start positioning yourself differently. And if that word found you at a specific time, as if it were explaining something you've been feeling, don't ignore it, because there are messages that do not arrive by chance. If you have felt this in the depths of your soul, write in the comments, "God has chosen me," and allow this truth to begin to strengthen your way of facing all that is before you. And when this spiritual awareness deepens, something even higher begins to emerge. The understanding that your life is not just about what you face or achieve, but also about the impact you can generate in the lives of others through intercession. Because there is a level of relationship with God where prayer ceases to be just about personal needs and becomes a mission, a spiritual responsibility to put oneself in the gap for others. Moses lived this intensely in one of the most critical moments of the people of Israel. When all indications of judgment, when the consequences seemed inevitable, he stood before God not to protect himself, but to intercede. And in Exodus 32:14, something impressive is recorded. Then the Lord repented of the evil which he said he would do to his people. This reveals the weight of a true intercession, a prayer that is not superficial, but charged with surrender, love, and spiritual responsibility. Ezekiel 22:30 further reinforces this call when God declares, "I sought out from among them a man who was in the gap." This phrase reveals a profound reality. God is looking for people who are willing to take a stand, to pray, to fight spiritually for others. People who understand that their words before God have an impact, that their prayers can change scenarios, protect lives, and open paths that were closed. To honor God through intercession is to accept this calling. It is to leave a passive position and take an active role in the spiritual world. It is to look at situations around you and not just observe, but to act in prayer. It is to carry people, families, circumstances in one's heart and present them before God with faith and perseverance. And when someone starts living like this, something changes profoundly. Life gains a greater purpose because it stops revolving only around itself. There is a broadening of vision, a greater sensitivity to perceive needs around us, a willingness to put oneself at God's disposal as an instrument. Intercession also reveals spiritual maturity because it requires constancy. It requires faith, even when there are no immediate results. It requires continuing to pray, even without seeing rapid changes. But it is exactly in this process that something powerful happens, because God does not ignore a heart that positions itself in this way. And often, what has not changed in human strength begins to be transformed through persistent prayer. Situations begin to align, people begin to be touched, paths begin to open unexpectedly. Because when someone puts themselves in the gap, something moves in the invisible. Perhaps you never thought that you could be part of it. But the truth is that everyone who decides to honor God is invited to this level of relationship, where prayer becomes an instrument of transformation, not only personal, but collective. And while you are still here, there is something even deeper being prepared, something that can expand your way of seeing your own life and your spiritual role. Maybe you've been waiting for answers for a long time, and this moment may not be a coincidence. Stay until the end, because something important will still be revealed to you. And when one begins to live at this level of intercession, something silently changes within one's heart, because one's view of life is no longer limited by circumstances, but guided by a deeper perception of God's presence and sovereignty. And it is exactly at this point that gratitude ceases to be just a reaction to good times, and becomes a constant expression of honor, a daily choice that completely transforms the way we live. Because it's easy to be thankful when everything is fine, when the answers arrive, when the doors open, but true gratitude is revealed when, even in the midst of challenges, the heart decides to recognize that God is still good, is still in control, is still present. In 1 Thessalonians 5:18, it is written, "In everything give thanks." This does not mean ignoring difficulties, but it does mean not allowing them to rob you of the conscience of who God is. Gratitude changes the focus. Instead of looking only at what is missing, she begins to value what has already been granted. Instead of fueling murmuring, it strengthens trust. And that's no small thing, because what you decide to focus on determines the way you live. A heart that constantly complains, weakens, becomes heavy, loses spiritual sensitivity. But a grateful heart remains light, attentive, and aligned. Jesus demonstrated this powerfully before he even performed a miracle. In John 6:11 it is written, "And when he had given thanks, he shared." Before the multiplication happened, he was already giving thanks. This reveals a deep spiritual principle. Gratitude does not depend on the result, it precedes the miracle. It creates an environment where God's intervention manifests itself in a natural way. And when someone understands this, they begin to live differently. Even on difficult days, he finds reasons to be grateful. Even in the midst of uncertainty, he recognizes God's faithfulness. This is not denying reality, it is seeing beyond it. It is choosing to trust that God is at work, even when it is not yet possible to see. This posture constantly strengthens faith because it keeps the mind aligned with God's truth. Instead of getting lost in negative thoughts or excessive worries, the person begins to remember what God has already done, the care he has already received, the doors that have already been opened. And this generates an inner security that does not depend on external circumstances. Gratitude also protects the heart because it prevents it from becoming insensitive. It keeps alive the perception of God's presence, even in small things. And little by little, what seemed ordinary begins to be seen as fun. What seemed small begins to be valued. And perhaps, without realizing it, you've become accustomed to focusing more on what you're missing than on what you've already received. But from the moment this key turns, everything begins to be seen in a different way. Life doesn't just change on the outside, but mostly on the inside. And if this message has reached you now, there is a reason. Perhaps it is a call to adjust the gaze, to change the way you see what is around you. And if you want to continue receiving words like this, which strengthen, direct, and bring you closer to God, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because there is still much more that can transform your journey. And when gratitude becomes a constant part of life, it naturally leads to an even deeper level of relationship with God, holiness as a lifestyle. Because a heart that recognizes the greatness of God cannot live anyway, it begins to desire something different, not out of obligation, but out of conscience. And this is exactly where many get confused, thinking that holiness is a set of heavy rules or an impossible requirement, when in fact it is a natural response from those who have understood who God is. In 1 Peter 1:16, it is written, "Be holy, for I am holy." This is not just a command, it is an invitation to live according to God's nature, to reflect something that goes beyond outward behavior. Holiness begins within, in the way of thinking, feeling, deciding. It is not built only by what is avoided, but by what is chosen daily. Joseph's story in Egypt reveals this very clearly. He was far from home, with no one around to watch his actions, in a position where he could easily give in without immediate consequences. But when he was confronted with the opportunity to sin, his answer was direct and profound, as it is in Genesis 39:9. "How can I do such wickedness and sin against God?" Notice that he didn't talk about fear of being discovered. He didn't talk about human consequences. He talked about God. This reveals the true foundation of holiness, the constant awareness of God's presence. When someone lives with this perception, choices change. Not because there is external pressure, but because there is an internal respect, a reverence that prevents certain attitudes, certain thoughts, certain paths. To honor God is to live with this active consciousness. It is to understand that each decision carries a spiritual weight, and this does not mean living in fear or guilt, but living with purpose, with intention, with clarity of what really matters. Holiness does not imprison, it protects. It avoids paths that could bring pain, confusion, and distance from God. In addition, it strengthens spiritually, because when you decide to live in an aligned way, something inside you becomes firmer, more sensitive, more connected. God's presence becomes more evident, direction becomes clearer, peace becomes more constant. But it is important to understand that holiness is not perfection. It is not about never making mistakes, but about maintaining a continuous commitment to the truth, getting up when you fall, adjusting the path when you realize that you have strayed. It's a daily process, a constant decision to stay aligned. And the more you live like this, the more you realize that this is not a burden, but a privilege. Because holiness brings you closer to God, strengthens your spiritual identity, and positions your life in a way that goes beyond the natural. It is a path that requires choice, but that delivers something that nothing else can offer, a life truly aligned with what God wants. And when holiness begins to be lived as a lifestyle, inevitably the spiritual walk enters a level where perseverance becomes essential, because there will not always be quick answers, there will not always be visible results, and often everything around will seem to invite you to give up. It is at this point that honoring God ceases to depend on momentary emotions and starts to require firmness, constancy, and decision. The early church lived this intensely. They had no facilities, no support, no human security. On the contrary, they faced persecution, threats, and constant rejection, and yet something inside them remained unshaken. In Acts 5:41 it is written, "They withdrew, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer reproach." This defies any logic, because while many would recoil in the face of pain, they found reason to continue. This reveals a profound truth. Spiritual perseverance is born not from the absence of difficulties, but from the conviction that it is worth continuing, regardless of what is happening. Because when someone understands who God is and what He has promised, giving up is no longer an option. James 1:12 reinforces this when it says, "Blessed is the man who endures trial." It's not just about going through the hardship, but about enduring, staying, resisting. There is a spiritual reward in this process, something that is only released to those who do not go back. And this is a point where many get lost, because they start with enthusiasm, with motivation, with expectation, but when time passes and things don't happen as they imagined, the strength decreases, doubt appears, and the desire to stop begins to grow. But honoring God at this level is continuing anyway. It is to keep the faith even without signs. It is to remain faithful even without recognition. It is to move forward even without fully understanding. Perseverance strengthens something within you that cannot be built in any other way. It matures character, adjusts expectations, teaches us to trust God in a deeper way. And gradually, you realize that you are no longer reacting as before, that your faith no longer depends on favorable circumstances, that your confidence does not fluctuate as before. And it is exactly in this process that God prepares you for greater levels, for deeper spiritual responsibilities, for experiences that could not be sustained without this foundation. Because what is built with perseverance remains. It is not superficial, it is not momentary. Those who learn to stand firm begin to experience an intimacy with God that goes beyond the ordinary. It is not just knowing about God, it is living with Him constantly, even on difficult days. It is to feel His presence sustaining, strengthening, and guiding each step. And maybe you're in a moment like that right now, where everything seems harder, where continuing takes more effort than before. But it is exactly in this place that something deeper is being formed within you, something that cannot be built in easy ways. Few people will understand this level of walking, but if you've made it this far, there's a reason. God is working in you in a specific way. So stay, keep going, don't stop now. Because what is being prepared goes far beyond what you can see at this moment. And after learning to remain firm even in difficult times, another challenge arises that needs to be overcome for the journey to continue advancing: fear. Because fear does not arrive in an evident way, it often presents itself in a subtle way, as doubt, as insecurity, as that internal voice that makes you retreat before you even try. And when it's not confronted, it paralyzes, distorts decisions, and prevents you from moving forward exactly where God is calling you. Honoring God also involves facing this fear, not ignoring its existence, but not allowing it to have dominion. Because fear may appear, but it cannot decide for you. And this is exactly what differentiates those who advance from those who remain imprisoned. The ability to act even when feeling pressure, even in the face of challenging scenarios. David experienced this in a remarkable way when facing Goliath. Everyone around was paralyzed, looking at the size of the giant, at the danger, at the impossibility. But David did not look the same way. He did not trust himself, nor his strength, nor his experience. He stated something that reveals the basis of his courage in 1 Samuel 17:45, "I go against you in the name of the Lord." It completely changes the perspective because he wasn't going alone. And this is exactly what many need to understand. Spiritual authority does not come from the absence of challenges, but from the awareness of those who are with you. In 2 Timothy 1:7, it is written, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power." This means that fear does not come from God, and therefore should not be accepted as a guide. But overcoming fear is not a one-time event. It is a constant decision. It is choosing to trust when everything tells you to back off. It is moving forward when logic points to the opposite. It is taking steps, even without total human security, because there is a greater trust sustaining it. And when you start living like that, something changes inside you. Fear loses space, courage grows, and what once seemed impossible begins to become possible. Not because circumstances change first, but because their position changed. You stop reacting based on fear and start acting based on faith. This spiritual authority also brings clarity. You begin to notice when fear is trying to limit you, when it is trying to prevent important decisions, when it is distorting reality. And by recognizing that, you choose not to submit, you choose to stand firm. And this opens paths that previously seemed closed. Because often, what is blocking progress is not the lack of opportunity, but the fear of taking the next step. And when this fear is overcome, something is released, something begins to flow. And perhaps there is something in front of you right now, a decision, a change, a step that needs to be taken, but that fear has tried to prevent. But the truth is that you don't have to wait for fear to disappear to act. You need to decide who will have authority, him or the faith. And when that decision is made, you start to push forward, even in the face of giants, not because you feel strong all the time, but because you know you're not alone. And that completely changes the outcome of whatever battle is ahead of you. And when fear ceases to have dominance and faith starts to drive your decisions, you begin to approach the deepest level of this journey, intimacy with God. Because so far you have learned to trust, to obey, to persevere, to win invisible battles. But there is something beyond all this, a relationship that is not only based on needs, but on true communion. Many seek God only when they need something, when they face difficulties, when they are in times of pressure. And there's nothing wrong with seeking help. But intimacy goes beyond that. It is not limited to requests. It is built on presence, on the desire to be with God simply for who He is. And it is exactly this that completely transforms the spiritual experience. Moises lived this reality in a unique way. In Exodus 33:11 it is written, "The Lord spoke to Moses face to face." This does not only mean communication, but proximity, relationship, real connection. Moses was not only looking for answers, he was looking for presence. And that choice made all the difference in the way he lived and led. In Psalm 25:14 it is written, "The intimacy of the Lord is to those who fear Him." This reveals that this level of relationship is not automatic. It is developed, built over time, through a sincere search, a willing heart, a life that values the presence of God above anything else. To honor God on this level is to desire to be with Him more than to receive something from Him. It is to find satisfaction in presence. It is to feel peace in silence. It is to realize that, even without words, there is a connection happening. And this changes everything, because life is no longer just a sequence of requests answered or not fulfilled, and becomes a constant walk next to God. Intimacy generates revelation. Things that once seemed confusing are starting to make sense. Decisions that seemed difficult become clearer. There is a direction that depends not only on logic, but on spiritual perception. And that brings security, because you know you're being guided. It also generates peace, a peace that does not depend on external circumstances. Even on difficult days, there is an inner balance, a trust that remains. And this peace does not come from quick answers, but from the certainty that God is present in every moment. In addition, intimacy creates a constant awareness that you are not alone. And this is one of the greatest transformations, because the feeling of abandonment disappears, fear loses strength, and life starts to be lived with a silent but extremely powerful certainty. And the closer you get, the more you want to stay, because it's not something heavy, it's not an obligation, it's a relationship that brings life, that strengthens, that sustains. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is within you a desire to get closer, to live something deeper, to get out of a superficial faith and into a true relationship. If this message is confirming something in your heart, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action," as a simple but sincere way to declare that you are willing to live this intimacy. And when this intimacy with God begins to become real, a need arises that sustains everything that has been built so far: daily renewal. Because no matter how much someone has lived, learned, or experienced, without constant renewal, faith begins to wear out, sensitivity decreases, and what was once alive becomes just routine. The spiritual life is not sustained by old experiences. What you fed yesterday is not enough for today. And this is exactly what many do not realize. They start well, they live deep moments, but over time they stop seeking this renewal, and little by little they lose the intensity, clarity, and connection they had at the beginning. Elias lived this very clearly. After one of the greatest spiritual victories, facing the prophets of Baal and seeing the power of God manifest itself in a supernatural way, he reached a point of exhaustion. The same man who faced crowds went into a state of deep emotional and spiritual weariness. This shows that even the strongest need to be renewed, but the most important thing was not the tiredness. It was the way God treated it. God did not reject him, did not ignore him, but led him to a process of restoration. There was care, there was time, there was renewal. This reveals that God does not expect you to stand on your own. He offers what you need to keep going. In Isaiah 40:31 it is written, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will go up with wings like eagles." This shows that this force is not automatic. It is renewed as there is searching, waiting, connection. It's not something you get once and never need again. It's something you need to be fed continuously. Colossians 3:10 complements this by saying, "And you put on the new one, which is being renewed for knowledge." There is a continuous process happening, a renewal that does not stop, that adjusts, that strengthens, that transforms. And honoring God is also valuing this process. It is not neglecting this daily care for one's own spiritual life, because when there is no renewal, everything begins to lose meaning. Prayer becomes mechanical, reading loses depth, faith becomes repetitive. But when there is renewal, everything comes back to life. God's presence becomes perceptible again, the word speaks clearly again, the heart becomes sensitive again. And this renewal does not have to be complicated, it happens in constancy, in the decision to set aside time, to seek, to position oneself. It is a daily encounter, a continuous adjustment, a surrender that is renewed every day. And those who live like this do not stagnate. It is always growing, always advancing, always deepening. Faith does not stand still. It is strengthened, expands, becomes firmer over time. And little by little, this constant renewal creates a solid foundation where life no longer depends on isolated moments, but on a continuous flow of presence, direction, and empowerment that sustains each step, preparing the way for something even deeper that is about to be revealed. And when this renewal becomes a constant part of life, something essential begins to align: the way you make decisions. Because it is not only great choices that define the course of life, but also those silent decisions made on a daily basis, often without reflection, without direction, only guided by impulse or emotion. And it is exactly here that many go astray, not for lack of faith, but for lack of wisdom. Honoring God also manifests itself at this point in the way you decide, in the way you react, in the way you choose paths. Because decisions made without seeking God's direction can generate consequences that go far beyond the moment. And the problem is that many times the mistake does not seem like a mistake at first. It seems just a common choice. But over time, it reveals the weight it carries. Solomon understood this early on in his journey. Faced with a great responsibility, he did not ask for riches, he did not ask for power, he did not ask for recognition. He recognized his limitation and made a request that completely changed his story. At 2 Chronicles 1:10 he said, "Give me now wisdom and knowledge." This request reveals a level of spiritual awareness that many ignore, the need to depend on God to decide correctly. And this wisdom is not distant or inaccessible. In James 1:5 it is written, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God." This means that there is a source available, a direction that can be sought, an orientation that can avoid mistakes, confusion, and unnecessary paths. But there is a condition: you have to stop and search. Because haste is one of the greatest enemies of wisdom. Impulsive decisions made in the heat of the moment usually ignore what God could reveal if there were a time of waiting, of prayer, of reflection. And honoring God in this context is exactly that, not acting just because you can, but acting because you have been directed. God's wisdom not only shows the right way, it also protects. She avoids choices that could bring pain, avoids paths that seem good but hide traps, avoids decisions that could compromise the future. And when you start living like that, something changes profoundly. Insecurity decreases because there is clarity. Anxiety loses strength because there is direction. And decisions are no longer a burden and become firm steps, guided by something greater than one's own limited perception. This does not mean that all decisions will be easy, but it does mean that they will not be made in the dark. There is a light, a direction, a conviction that underpins every choice. And this brings stability, because even in the face of uncertain scenarios, there is a confidence that you are being guided. And little by little, this practice becomes natural. Before you decide, you search. Before you act, you consult. Before moving forward, you position yourself. And this creates an aligned life where each step is taken with purpose, avoiding detours and building a solid path that reflects the honor of God in every detail. And when wisdom starts to direct your decisions, there is an element that becomes indispensable to sustain all this: humility. Because it's no use having direction, it's no use having understanding if the heart isn't aligned. And it is exactly here that many get lost. Start well, learn, grow, but along the way, they let pride enter in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. And this begins to block what God wants to do. Humility is not weakness, as many think. It is spiritual strength. It is the ability to recognize that no matter how far you have advanced, you are still completely dependent on God. It is to keep the heart teachable, open, willing to learn, willing to adjust, willing to recognize when it makes mistakes. And this is something that cannot be ignored, because pride does not present itself in an evident way. It hides itself in small attitudes, in silent thoughts, in a self-sufficiency that grows little by little. The story of King Uzziah shows this clearly. He started well, was blessed, prospered, had achievements, but at a certain point, pride took place. And what began with honor ended in a fall. This reveals a serious principle. It's not just how you start, but how you stay. And without humility, it's impossible to stay aligned. Jesus taught this directly in Matthew 23:12. He who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. This reversal reveals the pattern of the kingdom of God, where true elevation does not come from placing oneself above, but from standing humbly before God. James 4:6 further reinforces it when it says, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." This means that pride creates a barrier. It prevents the flow of grace. It closes spiritual doors that only humility can open. And on the other hand, when there is a humble heart, something different happens. There is favor, there is direction, there is a more evident presence of God. Honoring God is living with this kind of heart, not trying to prove something to others, not seeking recognition, but seeking alignment. It is to recognize limitations. It is to depend on God in every step. It is to understand that without Him, nothing can be sustained. And when someone lives like this, the journey becomes lighter, because there is no pressure to be perfect. There is the freedom to grow. There is room to learn, to evolve, to mature. And this creates a deeper connection with God, because there is no resistance, there is surrender. Humility also keeps you sensitive. It keeps the heart from hardening. It keeps faith from becoming superficial. It keeps alive the awareness that everything comes from God and everything depends on Him. And as you continue on this journey, there is something even deeper being prepared, something that can only be revealed to a heart that is willing to remain sensitive and aligned. In the next moments, something can connect directly with what you are experiencing now, something that can bring a clarity that you have not yet had. So stay tuned, because this message might be just what you needed to hear. And when humility starts to shape the heart, something begins to change in the way you see what you have, because it is no longer just something yours and starts to be seen as something that God has entrusted in your hands. And it is exactly here that generosity reveals itself as a profound principle of the kingdom, not as an obligation, but as a natural expression of those who understand that everything comes from God and can be used for something greater. The early church lived this so intensely that it became a visible mark among them. In Acts 4:34 it is written, "There was none among them in need." This did not happen by chance, but because there was a collective understanding that what each one had could meet the needs of the other. It wasn't about excess, it was about willingness. It wasn't about quantity, it was about heart. And that kind of generosity reveals something much deeper than just giving. It reveals trust. Because only those who really believe that God is the provider can live like this, that what is delivered will not be a lack, but part of a flow where God continues to supply. Proverbs 11:25 states, "A generous soul will prosper." This speaks not only of material prosperity, but of a life that flows, that does not get stuck, that does not become limited by the fear of missing out. Because there is something that often traps people, the scarcity mentality. The idea that if it happens, it will be lacking, that it needs to keep everything, control everything, hold everything. But when one begins to live by the kingdom perspective, that changes. Security is no longer in what accumulates and becomes in those who sustain. Honoring God is also breaking with this mentality. It is understanding that what is in your hands can be an answer to someone's life. It can be a resource, a help, a word, a gesture. Generosity is not limited to money. It manifests itself in attitudes, in availability, in sensitivity to perceive the needs of the other. And when you live like this, something happens inside you. There is a freedom that cannot be explained, because you stop living trapped in the fear of losing and start living with the joy of contributing. The heart becomes lighter, more open, more connected with what really matters. In addition, you start to participate in something bigger. God begins to use you as an instrument, as a channel, as a bridge to reach other people. And this brings an even deeper sense of purpose, because your life is no longer just about what you receive and becomes also about what you release. And the most interesting thing is that as long as you become a channel, God remains the source. And this dynamic creates a constant flow, where what arrives does not get stuck, but moves, reaches, transforms. And little by little, you realize that living like this does not generate loss. It generates abundance. Not necessarily in the sense that the world understands, but in peace, in purpose, in connection with God. Because when you honor God through generosity, You align yourself with his heart, and that completely changes the way you live and see everything around you. And when generosity becomes part of life, it reveals something even deeper that cannot be ignored: the intentions of the heart. Because it is possible to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, it is possible to act externally in the right way, while internally there is something misaligned. And it is precisely here that true honor to God becomes even more demanding, not only in what you do, but in why you do it. God does not only observe attitudes, he examines the interior, that which no one sees, that which cannot be disguised, that which often not even the person himself fully perceives. In Psalm 24:3-4 it is written, "Who shall go up to the mountain of the Lord? That which is clean in hands and pure in heart." This shows that it is not enough to have correct actions. It is necessary to have an aligned heart, without duplicity, without ulterior motives. Jesus reinforces this at Matthew 5:8 when he declares, "Blessed are the pure in heart." This purity is not linked to perfection, but to sincerity, integrity, inner truth. It is to live in such a way that what you show is exactly what you are, without masks, without characters, without the need to appear something that does not correspond to reality. The story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5 reveals the danger of living a spirituality based on appearance. They were not only confronted by an action, but by the intention behind it. They tried to appear more spiritual than they really were. They tried to build an image that didn't reflect the truth. And this shows how seriously God takes what is hidden. To honor God is to live with this constant awareness. It is to allow him to deal not only with behaviors, but with motivations. It is to question one's own heart. It is to align thoughts. It is to seek an inner truth that sustains everything that is done externally. And when someone lives like this, something powerful happens. There is a lightness that cannot be explained, because there is no need to sustain an image. There is no fear of being discovered. There is no internal conflict between what one is and what one shows. Everything becomes simpler, more true, more authentic. This purity also strengthens communion with God, because there are no barriers, there are no hidden areas, there is no resistance, there is transparency, there is delivery, there is a real relationship without filters. And that builds spiritual confidence, a security that comes from knowing that you're living righteously before God. And little by little, this integrity begins to reflect in all areas of life. Decisions become clearer, relationships more true, faith firmer. Because there is no more division, there is unity between the inside and the outside. And this alignment creates a solid foundation where life is no longer sustained by appearances and starts to be built on truth. A truth that does not need to be proved because it is lived. A truth that does not depend on recognition because it is already established before God. And when this purity of intent comes to rule the heart, you are able to respond to God in a way that many cannot, with an obedience that depends not on logic but on trust. Because there are times on the journey when God will not explain everything, will not detail each step, will not make the path comfortable to human eyes. It only gives a direction, and it is at this point that honor manifests itself most intensely. Naaman experienced exactly this type of confrontation. He was an important man, respected, accustomed to great results, and when he sought healing, he probably expected something worthy of his position. But the instruction he received was simple, even disconcerting. In 2 Kings 5:14 it is written, "Then he went down and plunged, and he was cleansed." Before that there was resistance, there was questioning, there was internal struggle, because logic said that it didn't make sense. And this is the point where many get stuck. It is not a lack of faith, but difficulty in obeying when instruction does not live up to expectations. Because the human mind wants to understand before acting, it wants to feel security before taking the step, it wants to have assurances before trusting. But radical obedience works in another way. It moves first, even without fully understanding it. Mary expressed this clearly in John 2:5 when she said, "Do whatever he tells you." This phrase carries a powerful principle. It's not about choosing what makes sense. It's about doing everything, even what seems simple, strange, or non-standard. Because often, the miracle is not in the greatness of the action, but in the fidelity to the instruction. To honor God at this level is to decide to obey even when there is no complete explanation. It is to act even when the mind questions. It is to trust even when the scenario does not confirm it. And that requires an aligned heart, a sensitive spirit, and a willingness to put God's word above logic itself. And when that obedience happens, something moves supernaturally. Doors that were closed begin to open, situations that seemed stagnant begin to line up, answers begin to emerge where there was silence before. Not because there was enough human effort, but because there was spiritual alignment. Radical obedience unlocks that which cannot be accessed in any other way. There are things that will not happen only with intention, only with desire, or only with prayer. They demand action. They demand a response. They require a step of faith that breaks the barrier of doubt. And maybe there's something that God has already shown you, something simple, something direct, but it hasn't been done yet because it doesn't seem to make sense. But that may be exactly where the key lies, exactly in that instruction that has been ignored or postponed. And as you continue on this journey, something even deeper is being prepared, because there are spiritual levels that are only accessed by those who choose to trust without reservation. At the end of this path, something can happen in such a real way that you will realize that every step, every decision, and every obedience was leading you to that moment. Stay, because what comes next can mark your life in a way you've never experienced before. And when this radical obedience begins to be part of his life, something extraordinary begins to occupy the place that was previously dominated by anxiety, restlessness, and fear of what may happen: the peace of God. Not a common peace, not a fleeting tranquility, but a peace that does not depend on circumstances being favorable, a peace that remains even when everything around seems unstable. Because there is a profound difference between the peace that the world offers and the peace that comes from God. Natural peace depends on control, on responses, on visible security, but God's peace is born exactly where these things do not exist. It arises when you decide to trust, even without understanding, when you rest, even without having all the answers. Paul describes it directly at Philippians 4:7. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts. This means that this peace cannot be explained by logic. It doesn't make sense to those who look at it from the outside, because it remains in situations where humanly there should be despair. And yet it guards the heart, protects the mind, sustains the inside. Jesus reinforces this in John 14:27 when he states, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you." He wasn't talking about something superficial, but about a peace that comes from the very essence of who he is. A peace that is not shaken by news, that is not broken by difficulties, that does not disappear in the face of uncertainty. Honoring God is also learning to live in this place, where trust replaces anxiety. Because anxiety is born from trying to control what is not in your hands, but peace is born from surrender, from the certainty that God is in control, even when you are not. And that doesn't mean that problems go away. Situations keep happening, challenges keep coming up, but the way you respond changes completely. What used to take away your sleep no longer has the same effect. What used to generate fear no longer dominates, because there is something stronger sustaining you inside. This peace becomes visible evidence, People notice even without you talking. They notice a different stability, a calm in the midst of chaos, a firmness that is not common. And it doesn't come from you, it comes from God working in you. And the more you learn to rest in Him, the more that peace is strengthened. It's not something you get once and it's over. It's something that grows as you trust more, deliver more, depend on more. It is a process, but it is a process that completely transforms the way of living. Perhaps you are facing something right now that would normally take away your peace, something that at another time would leave you restless, worried, without direction. But if that word has come to you, it may be because God is calling you to that level of rest, to that place where peace doesn't depend on what's going on, but on who's in control. And if you feel like this message found exactly what you're living today, as a silent confirmation that God is taking care of everything, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord," as a simple act of faith, declaring that you choose to trust, even if you don't fully understand. And after everything that has been revealed so far, a truth becomes impossible to ignore. It is not enough just to understand, it is necessary to deliver. Because the peace that you have begun to feel, the direction that has been awakened, the confidence that has begun to grow, all of this points to a decisive moment, the moment of placing before God that which is within you. Not as empty words, but as a real, conscious, profound surrender. God's word reminds us at Jeremiah 29:13, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." This reveals that it is not a superficial search, but a true encounter, where there are no reservations, where there are no hidden parts, where everything is placed before Him. And in Psalm 37:5 it is written, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will do it." There is a promise linked to surrender, a response that only manifests itself when there is surrender. Now, this is the time to transform everything that has been absorbed into attitude. Not just listening, but taking a stand. Not just reflect, but open up. Put before God your thoughts, your fears, your decisions, your dreams, and everything that has occupied your heart. Let's pray together with confidence, knowing that He is present and ready to act. Beloved Father, your word assures us that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and it is with that sincere heart that we draw near to you now, recognizing that without your presence nothing makes sense, but with you everything finds direction, healing, and purpose. Today, after all that has been reflected, I thank you, because your voice has reached us, your truth has awakened us, and your Spirit has led us to a deeper place of understanding. Thank you that even when we didn't realize it, you were already working within us, aligning thoughts, breaking resistances, and calling us to a life of true honor before you. Lord, I ask you now, strengthen every heart that is in prayer at this time. It gives wisdom to make correct decisions, courage to obey even when it is not easy, and faith to trust even when there are no clear answers. Teach us to live all that we have learned, not just as words, but as a daily practice, as a lifestyle that reflects your presence in every detail. May we honor your name in thoughts, attitudes, and intentions, living in a whole, sincere, and totally surrendered way to you. Father, reach out now to those who are weary, afflicted, or burdened, bringing rest to the soul and renewal to the spirit. It visits every home that needs peace, restores broken relationships, brings unity where there is division, and healing where there is pain. Provide for the financial needs of those who are struggling. Open doors where everything seemed closed, and pour out your provision in a supernatural way. Stretch out your hand over the sick, bringing healing, relief, and complete restoration, because we know that you remain the God who heals and transforms. At this moment, in silence, each heart turns to you, presenting its struggles, its fears, and its deepest requests. Receive, Lord, every prayer that has not been said aloud, but is now being delivered in faith and sincerity before you. And we give you everything, Father, our plans, our dreams, our worries, and even what we can't understand. We place everything in your hands, trusting that your will is perfect and that you are in control of all things. May our lives be aligned with your purpose, and may we walk safely, knowing that we are being guided by you. May your peace, which surpasses all understanding, guard our hearts and minds, bringing balance, rest, and confidence to each new day. It strengthens our faith, sustains our steps, and leads us in victory, because we know that those who trust in the Lord will never be shaken. And so we pray with gratitude and hope, in Jesus' name, amen. If this prayer represents what is in your heart, write Amen as an act of faith and surrender. After all that has been revealed here, one truth needs to echo within you. Honoring God is not a detail of life, it is the center of everything. Every teaching, every principle, every biblical example you heard was not by chance. This message is for you. God chose you to hear this today because He wants to align your life, restore what is out of place, and lead you down a path where everything begins to make sense, not because problems disappear, but because you learn to live in the right direction. Honoring God transforms decisions, heals the soul, brings peace, strengthens faith, and releases a level of protection and purpose that cannot be achieved otherwise. Now, the question that remains is simple but profound. What are you going to do with all this you've just heard? I'm very happy to know that we are together on this journey of faith, growth, and transformation. You are not here by chance. You are part of something bigger. And if this message spoke to you, I want to invite you to take a simple but important step. Leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are not yet subscribed, and activate the bell to continue receiving content that can strengthen your walk with God. And more than that, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters, and there is a powerful force when we come together in faith and prayer. But it doesn't stop here, because this journey continues. In the next video, you will dive even deeper into how to live in the presence of God in a practical way on a daily basis, understanding signs, decisions, and paths that often go unnoticed. There is something being prepared for you, something that can completely change the way you see your spiritual life. Don't ignore it, because it might be just the next step you need to take. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.